begin, I wanted to make a note that we will be recording today's session and send out the presentation slide to all those who registered for today's webinar. We hope you find this session informative and helpful to you, your community, and your organization. As another note, we will have a number of opportunities for you to share your feedback, ask questions throughout the presentation. We encourage you to use the chat function during today's session and help us maintain a respectful and inclusive virtual space. Feel free to use the Q&A function to ask your questions specific to our presentation, and we will do our best to address them. And any questions that we are unable to get to or answer, we will be sure to follow up with you via email. Thank you all so much for being in community with us today. I'd like to formally welcome you all for joining us today's webinar on survivors at work, findings in the workplace experiences. My name is Sabrina Ham, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Director of System Change at FreeFrom, and I will be moderating today's conversation. So just to do a quick overview of what to expect, we will briefly do introductions of FreeFrom and our work, and do an overview of the Survivors at Work project, walk through key insights from our findings. There will be an opportunity for you all to ask questions about the data, and that will be followed by a walkthrough of Survivors at Work landing page and ending with a closing activity. So just a little bit about FreeFrom, in case you are unfamiliar with our work. In case you're unfamiliar with our work, we are a national survivor-led organization with a mission to build a world free from gender-based violence, where everyone is free to live to their full potential. We do this work through bold survivor-led programs, research, systemic change that work to build survivor economic freedom. Ultimately, activating everyone in society to reframe what they think about gender-based violence and understand that they too have a role to play in ending gender-based violence before, during, and beyond moments of crisis. Just a little bit about our Survivors at Work project. So as part of our programming, we have our safety fund that provides unrestricted cash grants directly to survivors. In fall of 2021, we asked over 2,400 survivors to share about their experiences as a survivor in the workplace, with an interest in learning directly from survivors about the intersection of gender-based violence and employment. With this presentation contains mentions of gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, economic abuse, trauma, court appearances, police, workplace discrimination, job loss, and physical harm. Please take care of yourself in whatever way you feel comfortable throughout this presentation. If you need to mute me, step away, take a break, whatever that looks and feels like for you. And now I will hand it over to Pilar to introduce herself and share more about the main findings of the report.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So I will be walking us through the main findings of this report. Just a heads up, I will be walking through a lot of numbers and statistics. So I do encourage you to also think about, the survivors and individuals that are behind these statistics. I will also leave a few minutes after my presentation for Q&A. So we do ask that you hold off for any questions until after I am done walking through these slides. So next slide, please. Just wanted to start with providing an overview of who the survivors who participated in the safety fund were. We had over 2,400 survivors from across the US, from urban, suburban, and rural areas. We also want to highlight just some of the main key demographics. In this particular slide, we have the top demographics for some of the categories that we asked folks about. 35% of survivors were disabled, 33.5% were Black or African American, 33.1 were Hispanic Latinx survivors. We also had a diversity in terms of sexuality and gender. 17.3 were queer survivors, 14.66 transgender, and almost a quarter of survivors were immigrants, and they range in age from 18 to 75. Next slide. All right, so as Sabrina mentioned, one of the purposes of this safety fund is we really wanted to understand the intersection between harm and work. So in order to do that, we asked survivors about their employment status and employment history, which is what I will walk through next. At the time of the safety fund, almost half, so 46.7% of survivors were not employed. Of those who were employed, which was 40%, almost 70% of them mentioned that they had to work at least 2 jobs at the same time in order to make ends meet. We wanted to know where survivors worked. So we asked them about those who were employed, what were the sectors that they primarily had worked in the last 5 years. The large majority of them worked in hospitality, service, and retail. That was 35.5%. 16.3% worked in the nonprofit sector, and 11% worked in care and domestic work. Some other sectors that survivors mentioned that they worked in included healthcare, education, and government. I do want to note that the reported average salary here, it was adjusted for inflation. It's $39,673.75. I want to point out that this salary is probably skewed towards survivors with greater financial need, given that this was a safety fund that was attached to providing cash assistance to survivors. Nonetheless, we do know that gender-based violence has financial consequences for survivors. So this is almost yet another component that gets at survivors' precarious financial situations. Next slide, please. So we did ask survivors who were unemployed, what were some of the top barriers to their employment, to finding a job or earning income. The main one, 40% of survivors said that it was due to caring for children, family members, or others who depending on them. I won't walk through all of these, but I do want to point out those that are particularly relevant for individual survivors. So this is the last data point in this bar graph, says that 26% of survivors did not have a job or an income because a harm doer actually prevented them from seeking work, getting a job, or earning income. And then there's also this other data point to the right of the slide. 22% of survivors reported that a harm doer preventing them from getting the training, work experience, or education that they needed in order to pursue a job or a career. So I know this was a lot of numbers. We want to encourage you at this time, if you have any thoughts or about whether these findings resonate with you, or if you work with survivors, with any of the survivors that you work with. So, feel free to engage in the chat. I know some folks have already been dropping in some things in there, but if there's anything about these data findings that resonate with you, we'd love to know more about it. And we give a couple of minutes for that. Also, if you feel comfortable sharing it with the group, feel free to do so. But also, if you'd rather just share your thoughts with the panelists, you also have an option to do that as well. And Sabrina will help me read out some of thoughts if folks have them at this time. Okay, we encourage anyone. We know also some of these topics that we're discussing today are heavy, so we encourage you to express or engage as much or as little as you'd like with us today. And feel free to continue to drop in your thoughts in the chat. But for the purposes of time, I will move us along to the next part of the presentation. Sabrina, next slide, please. Okay, so as we mentioned at the start, as Sabrina mentioned, we were particularly interested in trying to understand survivors' experiences at work. and what was the intersection between being subjected to harm and their workplace experiences. So this is kind of like the main findings I will talk about next. So in this slide, I want to point out some of the things that survivors shared with us. They overwhelmingly reported that being subjected to gender-based violence had both immediate as well as long-term effects on their ability to work and earn an income. While at the same time, they mentioned that they received little or no support at the workplace. So some of the stats that I want to highlight for you in this slide is almost 40% of survivors said that they were forced to leave a job as a result of the harm that they were subjected to. 84.2% reported having an impact on their job performance that had resulted from being subjected to GBV. Almost all survivors, so an overwhelming majority, 90.3%, said that a harm doer had disrupted their ability to obtain or to keep their job. Survivors also mentioned being subjected to harm at the workplace, which I will discuss a little bit more later in a couple of slides, but 74% specifically mentioned being subjected to economic abuse in the workplace itself. And 73% reported job or income loss or missed career opportunities resulting from GBV. I know these are a lot of numbers, but I do want to emphasize, like, these are very, very high percentages. And so we're seeing that the intersection of being subjected to harm really is having an impact on survivors' ability to keep, maintain a job, and, thrive in the workplace. So we also asked survivors about their ability to perform at work and how GBV had impacted that for them. And, for many of them, being subjected to GBV had a direct impact on their ability to be successful at the workplace. Some of these impacts included an inability to focus. So we heard from a lot of survivors just feeling distracted, thinking that the harm doer would show up at the workplace or having to be thinking about their safety concerns. Survivors similarly also mentioned just making more mistakes, not being fully able to focus at work led to them, having to do tasks, and create more mistakes along the way. And also just generally an inability to be productive. Even if they wanted to, due to some of the consequences of the harm, they just were not able to perform at their best capacity. So I want to read a quote from one of the survivors that kind of illustrates some of these consequences. So they shared, "I have long-term PTSD due to gender-based violence I've experienced throughout my life. My PTSD has caused me to lose jobs and makes it difficult for me to do well at work." And this was a finding that came up over and over again. Some of the mental health consequences from the harm that that survivors were subjected to had a direct impact on survivors' ability to do well at work. Next slide, please. Okay. We were also interested in seeing how gender-based violence and survivors' ability to take time off to deal with the consequences was relevant for this group of survivors. And what we learned is that gender-based violence forces survivors to miss work. This group of survivors mentioned that they had to use an average of 12 days of vacation and 11 days of sick leave to deal with the consequences of harm. And we know that having to deal with the consequences of harm, whether that's going to court, whether that's, seeking mental health support, dealing with a harm doer, that is neither vacation nor sick leave. And also survivors, 74.4% experienced that they had to deal with barriers in order to take time off. So, some of them mentioned that they had to work while they were sick, or they risked actually losing their jobs if they asked for time off to deal with the consequences of harm. And for many of those who were not able to take the time off, they experienced burnout from, not being able to use time off and also having to deal with the harm at the same time. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, seeing that folks are interacting in the chat, we do want to share if there's anything in this data that surprises you or doesn't surprise you at all. Again, we'll give folks a little bit of time to do that, and Sabrina, feel free to read any of these thoughts that folks have shared or share with us.
Yeah, thanks, Pilar. Give everyone a few seconds if they want to share in the chat directly to me or Pilar.
I do see a comment about disabled justice, which do want to highlight, definitely was something that came up over and over again. And folks, disabled folks kept mentioning how they had a lot of difficulty just being able to find employees who accommodated them for their disability. And also the fact that we have such a high percentage of folks in our sample, 35% that were disabled, really does make us think about, you know, the intersection of disability and survivors and harm as well. So that is definitely something that we have found time and time again, that we have proportionally very high rates of disabled folks who are survivors within the safety funds that we tend to conduct. So definitely something that we want to advocate for, disability justice.
Thank you, Pilar. And then just to pull out a comment from someone in the chat about folks working in the nonprofit sector with burnout and issues with scarcity, that this could also, I'm assuming that this could also mean that they'll have an impact on survivors in the workplace. So thank you. Thank you all for your comment. And, you know, feel free to continue to share in the chat or in the Q&A as we continue the presentation. And with the interest of time, we'll continue on.
Okay, so next we were also interested in learning more about survivor sexual experiences at the workplace and how this impacted their feelings of safety, as well as whether they were subjected to harm. So next slide, please. So survivors widely reported feeling unsafe at work. The overwhelming majority, 82.5%, said that this was due to someone outside of the workplace. So many folks share that their harm doers would actually show up at the workplace, or they would, you know, be waiting for them after work. So the large majority of survivors said that the person who made them feel unsafe was actually someone outside of the workforce. However, a big group of survivors also mentioned that they were made feel unsafe by a customer or client, 57.2%, 51, so half. So we're talking about 1 in every 2 survivors mentioned that they were made feel unsafe by a coworker. And then also, not insignificant, 42% of survivors said that they were made to feel unsafe at work by their boss or manager or supervisor. Based on these data points that I just mentioned, we also asked survivors to elaborate with open-ended questions. And so the most common theme that came up when we asked survivors about being subjected to harm by a boss or manager, what came up over and over again was that they were subjected to verbal or emotional abuse, such as being shamed, gaslighted, or smeared. And in most cases, this was actually related to them being a survivor. So you know, we had a couple of folks, or a handful of folks, who mentioned that, you know, bosses or managers would dismiss survivors' harm or made them feel like it was their fault. There was victim blaming that was happening as well. And relatedly, we also asked survivors about the type of harm that they were subjected to by their coworkers. And it was not surprising, but they also mentioned that the main type of harm was also being subjected to emotional abusive behavior. There was bullying, there was criticism, judgment, mockery. Again, most of this was related to the fact that survivors had been, you know, that they were survivors of GBV, and, you know, they had coworkers who were not supportive of survivors' harm. Next slide, please. So some quotes again to illustrate some of this. One survivor shared with us that supervisors blamed them. Supervisors blamed me and requested too much historical information about past abuses when I was assaulted at the worksite. Another survivor said, coworkers picked up on the fact that I was out of it after I was assaulted and tried to just take all of my shifts and point out how poorly I was doing and that I wasn't focusing. So again, we asked survivors about their experiences of being subjected to sexual harassment and assault at the workplace. We found very high rates for both of these. So 52.5% said that they were subjected to sexual harassment by a customer, clients, patient, business partners, depending on the sector that they worked in. Half of survivors mentioned that they were subjected to sexual harassment by a coworker, and 40% by a boss or a manager. So again, I know I'm going through a lot of numbers, but I do encourage all of us to kind of like sit with some of these, because these are very, very high rates of harm that is happening directly at the workplace. In terms of sexual assault, 14.5% were subjected to sexual assault by customers, clients, patients, or business partners. 17.1% were subjected to sexual assault by a coworker, and 12.3% by a boss or manager. So again, all of these demonstrate widespread harm across the workplaces and by different sources as well. So we also wanted to know a little bit about survivors' experiences disclosing that they were survivors in work settings. We asked survivors if they had ever told a boss or a supervisor that they were a survivor, and 41.1% of them said that they had. The percentage was higher for when we asked survivors if they had ever shared with a coworker, and 58.4% had ever told a coworker that they were a survivor. And then as a follow-up, we asked survivors, would you have been more likely to disclose to a boss or a coworker if you knew that your workplace offered benefits or support specifically for survivors? And approximately 40% of them said that they would. So with this, we don't necessarily want to advocate for survivors sharing or not sharing. What we do know is, based on this data, is that having workplace benefits or support specifically for survivors, it is something that would motivate survivors to feel more comfortable or safe to disclose that they are a survivor at the workplace. The importance is just giving survivors and employers generally options. Knowing that there is the support for them there might make it more likely for them to disclose. Next slide. So again, a lot of devastating statistics that we went through today. So I do kind of, at least for this section, want to end on a little bit more of a hopeful note. Survivors had a ton of insights in terms of what can make workplaces more supportive and inclusive for survivors. 81.1% of survivors said that having access to workplace benefits or policies that are specifically designed for their needs would help them stay employed, or just worry less and focus more on the job. As we mentioned, a big barrier to survivors thriving in the workplace is their inability to perform well and to be able to focus and give it their all when they have so many things happening and going on. Some of the most common suggestions that survivors said would be supportive for them included paid and protected leave, having individualized support, so depending on the different needs that survivors have at that time, as well as having clear communication of what the workplace policies are. We did hear over and over again from survivors just a lack of knowledge about what the type of supports and benefits are for folks at the workplace. And then also something that came up over and over again is having culturally specific support as well. And then we also asked survivors, what are some things that you would like employers to know? And the top response that we got from survivors was very simple and straightforward. It's just survivors emphasize that employers should listen to and believe survivors, as well as check in on their well-being and needs. And also survivors called for comprehensive resources and support at the workplace. And specifically, they called for financial assistance. So one of the things that they recommended was having emergency cash grants in case something comes up, and the ability to for a workplace to provide that without having to pay it back. Also protections against retaliation or job loss, particularly, we saw that harm doers get in the way of survivors being able to pursue their job or career. So, if they're disrupting that, the workplace would be able to protect them against that. Childcare support, we saw that childcare needs and having to take care of a dependent was one of the main barriers for survivors to obtain employment. And then also something that came up was providing survivors with access to support groups within the workplace. Okay, so that is all for some of the main findings. Again, I know this was a lot of data and numbers. We do always want to complement with some quotes as well, just to be able to remember that behind each of these numbers, there's an individual story. But yeah, want to open it up if folks have any questions at this time, specifically to the data piece. And again, I'm going to ask Sabrina to help read out some of those if there are any.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll give everyone a minute or two to put their question in the Q&A function. Feel free to, if you want to do it anonymously or if you want to do it directly to either one of us, that is totally fine. I do see a couple in the chat that I will do my best to, that we'll do our best to try to address. I have a question about signing up for a safety fund. We have I'll be able to share more information on how to sign up for a safety fund. I'll need to connect with our programs team to be able to understand to understand when the next safety fund might open, and I can be sure to follow up with folks on that. I do have a question from someone else. I will share it out loud. So with the results of the impactful research in this report, how can we encourage and hold accountability for organizational change to best support survivors with sustained employment? Well, there's multiple questions in this, so I'll pause right there. Pilar, do you have any thoughts or ideas around holding organizations accountable for change to better support survivors?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the accountability piece is probably the trickiest part. I do want to highlight actually one of our other resources that we put together as a result from these findings, which is an employee guidebook. So based on what survivors shared that they needed at the workplace, we put together a toolkit for employers to be able to implement within their own workplaces recommendations that pertain both to the type of benefits that would help survivors thrive in the workplace, type of supports that they would need. And again, I think this is this gets at the piece of like what they can do at work to support survivors. The accountability piece is always, I think, the trickiest one. But at least we're putting out the type of resources out there and making them accessible. And I think part of it also is we heard back from survivors in terms of the type of outputs that they would like to see at the workplace. And one of the things that survivors came up with was having advocacy toolkits that they could use at work to advocate for better and more inclusive workplaces. So I'm thinking that that potentially could be something, a tool that survivors can use at work and, hold their workplaces accountable based on the things that they need. But it's a good question. I don't think I have a definitive answer for that. I don't know, Sabrina, if you do. I know that Sabrina works in the policy aspect of our work, so maybe that's another piece in which we can get at accountability as well. But great question.
Yeah, and there are a number of states that have certain protections, and unfortunately they're so wide, like they vary so widely, and the accountability piece of making sure employers are abiding by what's in state law is so different. And I think, again, to what Pilar had said, is that providing survivors with some resources, some guidance on what that advocacy piece can look like. And I think a part of this with the data that we have is, sharing that employers are employing survivors, whether they know it or not. If you look at just the statistics of 1 in 2 women and 1 in 2 trans folks will be subjected to some form of gender-based violence in their lifetime. That means that any employer is not only serving survivors but also employing survivors. And so hopefully maybe starting with that can really break down that barrier or that understanding that an employer needs to be doing something around supporting survivors. And then taking the next steps there. I feel like sometimes just education around and sharing more about and education around this issue is a good and helpful place to start. I see a couple more questions. I'm going to try to maybe pull out one or two more. And then says, is there additional information on the kinds of disabilities that survivors are navigating? Pilar, do you have answers for that one? Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks, Sabrina. Great question. We did ask survivors about the kinds of disabilities that they were navigating. So a large majority of them said that it had to do with mobility. I'm reading from my notes here since I don't have the stats here in the top of my head, but there was also a lot that came up in terms of cognition. And so we did find in some of the open-ended questions that folks talked about a physical consequence of being subjected to harm pertain to survivors' ability to, they talked about like foggy memory and just not being able to recall incidents. And so that was something that came up, I think was one of the highest ones in terms of just disabilities related to cognitive issues. And some of the other ones that came up also had to do with just like interpersonal and having a lack of ability to connect with other folks, interpersonal relationships as well. So yeah, a wide range of different disabilities. And I also want to point out another data point that when we asked survivors about some of the reasons as to why they were not did not have a job or earn income, 36.3% mentioned that the reason was because they had a disability. And while we did not directly ask if the disability was a result of the harm that they were subjected to, it did come up in some of the open-ended questions. So like I mentioned, some folks mentioned being subjected to physical harm, and that had directly led to their disability. So while it's not a question that we asked directly, it did come up on its own, and it is something that we want to be more intentional about asking in future surveys as well. I do encourage folks who are interested in this issue to look through our report, the full report, which breaks down some of the type of experiences by disability status. And we do see a lot of discrimination that's happening specifically for disabled survivors. And we also have additional quotes that, provide a more nuanced picture of disabled survivors in the workplace.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pilar. And one last question before we move on. And again, if we didn't answer your question, we'll do our best to do it offline, maybe via email or in the follow-up message. And so one last question here is Free From partnering with any workers' rights organizations to expand the findings and action items of this research? And so we, part of our systems change work, partner directly with employers. And so we provide them with a number of recommendations based on what we found in our survivors at work findings and say these are the number of things that you as an employer can better support survivors in the workplace. And so we've have conversations directly with employers and finding ways to be able to make some strides in that. But if anyone is interested in working with us directly or have ideas on advocacy work or want to partner with us or connect with us on that, we'd love to continue the conversation. All right, so I'm going to move on. I still see a couple more questions. Unfortunately, with the respective time, I'm not going to be able to address them now, but again, we'll do our best to address them after today's session. Okay, so I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of the landing page. So let me click on that. Give me 1 second as I make sure everything looks good. All right, so I'll be walking through the Survivors at Work landing page. We will share the link with you in the chat in case folks want to look at it as I'm talking through, or if you want to have it easily accessible, to walk through on your own at a pace that you'd like. So this is actually the first time we've created a dedicated page to share survey findings, and it came directly from survivor feedback and our focus groups. Survivors shared with us that they wanted a more accessible way to engage with the data, and we hope that this landing page makes what we learned directly from survivors easier to explore and find what you need, in addition to a more traditional report format that we have. So here is the landing page, freefrom.org's /survivors dash at work slash. And so if you go on this website, it is essentially all the data and survey findings directly from survivors. I know Pilar shared really high level key insights. And so we'll get really into detail about every question that we ask, all the data findings. If you want more information on the demographic, it's there. And so when you go onto the website, there'll be a content warning just so that you know what to expect and you can prepare yourself if this is a time for you to engage. Great. If not, then you can, always come back to it. And so this is the report. So there'll be a bit more detail about the project, the number of survivors, the goal of this project, sort of why we did this, what insights that we were looking for. And they'll all be right here. And then similar to what Pilar did, there's a section on key insights. So just very high level insights that we wanted to pull out from the report. And so if you just want to sort of get a better understanding generally about what this report looks at, you can have it. Then it's all here for you. And I won't go through any of the data pieces. This is really just a way for me to share what the landing page is and what some of the key features are. And so all the data that Pilar mentioned during her presentation is in here too. And so you'll be able to download the report as well. And so one other piece that I thought was really exciting is the data visuals. And so there are a number of different topics that we ask survivors. So obstacles to finding employment and maintaining a job. And so each one of these tabs, if you click this plus sign here, will open up and share more details about what we asked and what the findings are. And so if you want to know more about top obstacles to finding employment, for example, that's here. If you want to understand in more detail about the impact of, for example, gender-based violence on the ability to maintain a job, those data findings you can find there here under each one of these tabs. And so this gives you the ability to look at the data, find it more easily. If there's a very specific, data point that you're looking for, we're hoping that these various categories makes it easier for you to navigate and read through the data findings at your own pace. And so again, there's a number of different topics here and categories. So safety concerns at work, disclosures in the workplace, intersection of harm and work. And so again, there is a ton more data to look through. And so we were only able to cover so much in this webinar, and we hope that you'll be able to look through the data on the landing page and in the report in a way that you can quickly find. And so this can be a resource for you all if you are doing advocacy work, if you are a survivor and just wanted to understand what other survivors are saying or what they've shared. If you are an employer thinking about what sorts of needs and support and workplace benefits that you are considering, there's so many different ways to use this information, and we hope that this is a really great resource for all folks. And so in addition to the landing page, we have a number of a number of resources that you can download. So we have an executive summary, which is again very high level, similar to what Pilar mentioned. And so you can click on this and download the report. There will be a survey for each one of these. You don't have to fill it out, but we welcome it. Again, this is the first time we've done a landing page, and I would love your feedback on what it looks like, how you're navigating it. Any feedback that you have, we welcome it. And so you can fill it out or not, and you just click on download the report. And so this is the executive summary. So this is more of a traditional executive summary where you can either print it, have an electronic version, whatever that looks like for you. And this is an executive summary, so it's a much shorter version than the longer report. And so this won't have every single data finding, but just really the high level key findings. And you can and then you can download the report for the longer version, where this will have all of the data pieces that you can find on the landing site and a lot more detail here. And so this, again, this is more of a traditional report where you can download, read it through, have the electronic version if you want that in addition to what's on the landing page. So this will have a lot more graphics and more detail if this is what you're looking for. And then we have a data-driven insights for employers. And so this report is the audience that we thought in mind for this one is for employers. And so taking what we learned from survivors, these are the steps that they can do to create a more survivor supportive workplace. So based on what we learned from survivors, here are the benefits and support systems that they can do. Here's what we learned in terms of the types of benefits and policies that survivors said, yes, this would be helpful, this would be supportive. And you can find these recommendations in here. And again, this is a more of a traditional resource. This could also be a resource if you are work in an organization or a survivor and wanting to advocate for better workplace policies or share it with others as well. So this is another resource for you all. I'm going to go back here. And then at the bottom, there's other resources that we wanted to highlight. So if you want to look at what a model safe leave policy looks like, that's there. If you want to learn more about state laws, you can check that out. If you want to partner with us, connect with us, there is an option to do that. And then we have another resource on ending gender-based violence, an economic issue we all have a role to play in. So this is I think this is a really cool report. It really gives it lays out sort of why everyone has a role to play in ending gender-based violence. And so this report could be a way as a starting conversation for folks who may not understand that they can play a role in ending gender-based violence. So there's a number of resources here. You can open up each one of these tabs, use them as you see fit, and really hoping that this is, again, a resource for you all. All right, so I'm going to head back to our presentation and wanted to give folks another moment if they have any questions about the landing page or the report or anything else. I see a couple folks. The presentation slide and the recording will be available after to everyone who registered, so that will be a resource to you all. We can certainly share the link to the landing page again so that you have it. And then if you have any other questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A function. Give everyone a minute. I don't see any questions. If you have any questions later on, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A function, and we'll be sure to address them. All right, so before we wrap up today's conversation, I'd love if folks want to take a moment to share in the chat directly with us or with everyone else what one insight or piece of information you are walking away with after today's conversation. Was there any piece of data or information? What did it activate an idea for you to make change in your community or at your workplace, anything that you'd like to share. I'll give everyone a minute. Um, Pilar, since you've spent a lot of time with the data, is there maybe one or two pieces of like data or findings that really sticks with you?
Yeah, great question. I think I was particularly surprised. We do know before coming into this project, we understood, right, the financial consequences that they are devastating for survivors in terms of like being subjected to GBV, and how that impacts survivors' ability to save or, to find financial stability. But some of the data points that really stuck out for me were those that talked about how being subjected to harm directly led many survivors to were forced to leave their jobs, or also just directly pertain to their ability to have an income as well. So again, while we can't really say with this data that that was that's a direct consequence of the harm, we do that leads to survivors' precarious financial situation. We are just seeing yet another layer that's intervening with survivors' ability to get financial security, given the harm that they're subjected to. I think that on one side, but on the flip side, I also was, reading through many of the open-ended responses that we heard from some survivors, and their willingness and ability and resilience really came across some of the particularly open-ended responses, and just how willing survivors are to, when given the time and the space and the support that they need to be at the workplace and to show up and do work to the best of their ability. So I think something that I really took away from me was that in spite of all these difficult circumstances and harm that they're subjected to, that if we support survivors and if we provide them with the basic care and just listening to them, as many mentioned, that they will not only, be able to succeed in the workplace, but they will thrive. And bring in their own experiences and expertise only will make them even, better workers and help them with their healing journey as well. So I think that that's something that I would encourage folks as they read through our resources and reports to really also take some time to read through the quotes. We had a lot of quotes, and that really does help us paint a more nuanced pictures of survivors' experiences of harm, but also strength as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pilar, for that. And just to pull out a couple things from the chat, I see that someone mentioned that they know that they have rights in the workplace and should be able to ask for help without feeling alone. Survivors are important, and their rights, safety, brilliance, and labor are all valuable and worthy of care. Thank you all so much for this. I'm seeing some notes about how informative and helpful these data pieces are. And someone shared that more support is needed for survivors beyond basic awareness, and certainly resonate with that as well. I think that is, all the work that we are doing, and hopefully with this report and these findings that we're able to go beyond basic awareness. And so thank you all so much for sharing in the chat. Hopefully we can continue the conversation. So just to close up a bit. I'm going to end with a closing activity, and just wanted to give everyone a moment to reflect. And so I'm going to be walking through this closing activity with you all. So I'd like to give you all a moment to honor your feelings, thoughts, memories, and ideas that came up in today's conversation. I know that the data that we shared, it was a lot, and know that folks may resonate with it directly, and know that sometimes we may need more time to digest and really think through what we shared. Wanted to make sure to give you all a moment for that. And so I ask you, if you'd like, to write down any thoughts or feelings, memories that came up, draw them out, sit with them, make a to-do list, give them space in whatever way is meaningful to you all. Take a couple deep breaths if that's helpful for you all. Drink water, grab a snack, and think through your last thoughts. Again, we want to thank you all so much for engaging with us today and for your time. We hope you found today's webinar informative and useful in some way. We invite you to continue the conversation on May 28th. This webinar will discuss more in detail our recommendations on how to create a survivor supportive workplace based on what we learned. You can register via this QR code, or we will share the link in the chat so you can register directly. Thank you all again for your time, for this community, and for being with us today.
Thank you all so much.